He watched the boy approach, small and impossibly naive against the backdrop of a city built on blood and concrete, recognizing the lethal irony of the request instantly. This was the strength Leo sought, the power to destroy, neatly packaged by a life of relentless sacrifice, a path Don Alessandro Rossi desperately wanted to believe was finally closed. You look at the man who has everything, fear, respect, absolute control, and you only see the crown, never the gaping wounds hidden beneath. If you want to understand the true price of power, the silent devastation it leaves behind, you need to subscribe right now and follow this story until the very end, because the darkest strength always demands the highest cost, and for one innocent boy, that cost is rapidly approaching. Don Alessandro Rossi, known quietly as Sandro, felt the weight of the city settle on his shoulders every time he looked out across the harbor. The morning light was usually a promise, but for him, it was a reminder of how many promises he had broken, how many lives had been twisted in the service of his control. He sat in the opulent but sterile study of his Brooklyn brownstone, the silence broken only by the gentle clink of the ice in his glass of espresso. He was 70 years old, physically imposing but internally hollowed out by decades of necessary decisions. He was the boss, and he hated every minute of the solitude that title demanded. He was meant to be enjoying retirement in peace, but the quiet brought only ghosts. A small tremor ran through the house, not a natural vibration, but the muffled sound of his chief of security, Marco, handling an unauthorized breach. Sandro sighed, placing the glass down perfectly centered on the coaster. Nobody ever truly retired from this life. He stood, his movements slow but deliberate, the kind of stillness that preceded a storm. He reached the heavy oak door just as Marco's desperate whisper carried through the wood. "Boss, wait, he's just a kid." Sandro pulled the door open. Standing in the entrance foyer, dwarfed by the massive marble columns, was a boy, no older than 12, dressed in a faded, threadbare coat. The boy's face was etched with a premature seriousness, his eyes wide and direct, holding a depth of sorrow that Sandro instantly recognized. It was the look of a child who had seen the consequences up close. Marco looked frantic, gesturing apologies, but Sandro raised a silencing hand. The boy took 2 decisive steps forward, planting his small feet on the expensive Persian rug. He didn't flinch under Sandro's intense scrutiny. He held the stare of the city's worst man alive with startling courage. Sandro suddenly remembered the boy's father, Antonio, a loyal man whose life had ended brutally. Recently, caught in a territorial struggle Sandro had foolishly thought contained. The boy opened his mouth, his voice surprisingly firm despite a faint tremor. The words were not an accusation, nor a plea for charity. They were a demand, echoing the deep, terrifying misunderstanding of power that had fueled Sandro's entire life. Leo looked up at the dawn, the embodiment of untouchable authority and terrifying success, and spoke the sentence that cut straight through the cold, hardened layers of the Mafia Boss's soul. "Sir, please teach me to be strong like you." In that moment, the vision of the boy's father, bloodied and alone in the back of an alley 2 months ago, flashed across Sandro's mind. The Don, who hadn't cried since he was a child, felt a sudden sharp sting behind his eyes, a moisture he hadn't known he still possessed. It wasn't pity he felt, but a terrifying recognition of his own legacy, a legacy of necessary evil now being sought out by the purest innocence. The boss had a choice: protect the boy from the truth of that strength, or lead him down the inevitable path of lethal consequence. Before we dive deeper into the darkness Don Sandro must navigate, tell me, From which city and country are you following this gripping story? Your engagement helps us bring more powerful narratives like this one to life. Sandro recovered quickly, the brief flicker of vulnerability instantly shielded by the practiced mask of the dawn. Marco, the chief of security, watched the exchange with mounting dread, fully expecting the instantaneous order to remove the trespassing child. But the order never came. Instead, Sandro slowly walked around the boy, his gaze clinical, studying the worn leather of Leo's shoes, the faint scent of diesel and cheap coffee clinging to the fabric of his threadbare coat. It was the harsh, metallic scent of the streets, the life Sandro had clawed his way out of decades ago, the life that had ultimately claimed Antonio. Strength, Sandro echoed, the word a gravelly whisper that held the weight of untold violence. The thick Persian rug muffled his steps as he led Leo across the expansive foyer to his library. He indicated a large, plush velvet armchair, a piece that looked entirely too grand for the small figure who hesitantly sat down. "Tell me, Leo, what do you believe strength is?" Leo gripped the edge of the chair, his knuckles white against the dark fabric. His voice was steady, betraying the turmoil inside only through the slight quickening of his breath. "It's when people leave you alone. It's not being afraid when they look at you." He didn't mention the intimidating men who had visited his mother after the funeral, nor the quiet, pervasive dread that now haunted their small apartment in Red Hook. But Sandro saw it all reflected in the boy's taut shoulders, and the way his eyes instinctively tracked the movements outside the window. Leo wasn't looking for power or revenge. He was desperate for immunity. Sandro signaled Marco to leave the room, closing the heavy oak door on the world's immediate interference. He poured Leo a glass of sparkling water, treating the boy not as an annoyance, but as a potential mirror of his past self. As Leo drank, calming his nerves, Sandro pressed him gently about the incident involving Antonio. Leo revealed little about the perpetrators, only that they had relentlessly searched his father's old workshop afterward. He described them tearing apart the sawdust-covered room looking for something important. Then came the first solid clue. Leo described a small, intricately carved wooden box Antonio always kept locked away, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The men were furious when they realized it was gone. This revelation tightened a knot in Sandro's stomach. Antonio had been a master carpenter, but he had also served as an information runner for Sandro's network, using his workshop as a quiet drop-off point. If they had been hunting for that box, it meant they weren't just opportunistic criminals. They were looking for a specific piece of leverage, something Antonio had recently acquired and hidden. The strength Leo was seeking wasn't protection from common threats. It was defense against professional, lethal opponents who believed the box's contents might still be with the boy, or worse, with his grieving mother. The hidden danger had a precise, material target, and Leo, unknowingly, had just placed himself at the center of Sandro's lethal orbit. The name of the faction hunting the box echoed in the silent wood-paneled library. The Vultures. They were an emerging, vicious crew, specializing in acquiring assets through maximum disruption, completely lacking the old-world sense of territory or restraint that had once defined men like Sandro. Their leader, a man named Corvus, operated with a calculated ruthlessness that made traditional organized crime look quaint. Sandro despised them, not just for their methods, but because they represented the future of his world, a world entirely devoid of honor. Sandro felt the immediate suffocating weight of his responsibility. Antonio had been his man. Leo was Antonio's blood. He had to act, but involving Leo Teaching him the lethal strength he requested was unthinkable. Yet sending the boy back unprotected was a death sentence, now that the vultures were actively searching. Sandro made a rapid decision, a strategic pivot perfected over a lifetime of crisis management. Leo would stay. He needed protection, and Sandro needed to find that box and neutralize Corvus, ensuring that Leo's definition of strength never intersected with the reality of it. He called Marco back in, his voice tight, the smooth Italian accent hardening into command. "Marco, clean up the Red Hook situation immediately, discreetly. Find out exactly what Antonio took and what Corvus wants. Also, arrange for Mrs. Silva to move her family. Tell her it's a long-term contract with the union, relocation for her safety, paid for in full. She will not refuse." He looked at Leo, who sat watching the exchange, absorbing the language of authority. "Leo stays here. He is not a guest. He is family. He will learn the strength of discipline first, not the strength of the street. No exceptions." Marco nodded, already on his way out, the gravity of the mission etched onto his face. He knew that the moment Sandro took in a witness, the stakes elevated to a war footing. For the next few days, the quiet atmosphere of the brownstone was pierced by the sound of Leo's education. Sandro didn't teach him how to fight or how to use a tool of violence. Instead, he forced Leo to sit at the large mahogany desk, learning the meticulous art of ledger management. He taught him about the organization's logistics, the subtle power of information, the quiet precision of schedules and routines. Leo, eager for any form of power, applied himself diligently. He learned that true control often lay in knowing where every coin was spent and where every man was supposed to be. But the vultures were closer than they realized. One evening, as Sandro supervised Leo's practice with old accounting books, the exterior lights flickered twice, a specific coded warning that external surveillance had been detected near the compound. The proximity alarm was an unsettling, subtle confirmation. Corvus wasn't just looking for the box. He had identified Sandro's protective stance and viewed the Don's home as the new target. The innocent request of a small boy had just complicated the retirement of a mob boss into a fatal game of attrition. The dangers were closing in, demanding lethal consequences. The flicker of the exterior lights felt like a cold draft sweeping through the fortified walls of the brownstone. Sandro didn't react visibly, maintaining a calm facade for Leo, who was diligently adding up columns of non-existent expenses. But inside, the old engine of crisis management had roared back to life. He gently closed the ledger, covering the numbers with a broad, scarred hand. "That is enough for tonight, ragazzo," he said, his voice soft, almost paternal. "Go to the kitchen. Ask Mrs. Petrova for some cannoli. Tell her Don Sandro said you deserve it." Leo left, slightly confused by the abrupt end of the lesson, but excited by the mention of the sweet reward. The moment the door closed, Sandro moved with the speed of a man half his age, heading straight to the secure communication panel. Marco's report came in quickly. Corvus wasn't subtle. He had authorized a series of aggressive, probing movements across the neighborhood, testing Sandro's perimeter security with low-level intimidation, burnt-out cars, graffiti on a peripheral wall, and a persistent, low-frequency signal suggesting a sophisticated drone observation nearby. "He is making noise, boss," Marco reported over the encrypted line, the static a faint counterpoint to his concern. "He wants you to know he's there. He thinks he can outmaneuver the old ways. He is a vulture, Marco. He feeds on fear." Sandro responded, his eyes fixed on the live surveillance feed, watching a distant car loiter for too long at the intersection. We show him we do not fear. But first, we find the core asset, the box. Antonio would have never carried something so volatile. He gave it to someone he trusted, who could hide it in plain sight. Sandro realized the terrifying depth of the vulture's strategy. Corvus wasn't just trying to recover the box. He was trying to provoke Sandro into a massive show of force that would draw the attention of the authorities, weakening the foundation of the Don's entire operation. The boss felt the first real loss, the loss of his carefully constructed peace. He had wanted retirement, stability, a clean ending. Now, the cost of Leo's presence was the immediate threat of total organizational collapse. The next day, the consequence of the escalating risk became tangible. One of Sandro's old friends, the owner of a legitimate shipping warehouse who sometimes helped with logistics, reported a devastating fire. The loss of life was averted, but the warehouse was gutted. Marco confirmed the sabotage was targeted, Corvus sending a clear message: interfere, and everything you touch burns. Sandro looked at the ashes, symbolized by the smoky smell Marco carried back on his jacket, and knew the truth. The hidden danger was no longer veiled. It was an open declaration of war, and Leo was the unwilling centerpiece. This story of true strength and lethal consequences is just heating up. But we can't bring these intense narratives to you without your support. We are rapidly approaching a massive milestone, 1,000 subscribers, and every subscription genuinely helps us keep telling these epic stories. If you're enjoying the high stakes and deep drama, hit that subscribe button now. Let's reach that goal together so we can bring you even more content of this quality. The attack on the warehouse, a violation of the unspoken rule against collateral damage, confirmed the brutal nature of Corvus. Sandro felt a cold, familiar rage, not the hot, uncontrolled anger of youth, but the deep, strategic fury of an aging predator whose territory has been challenged. He was sitting in the library, the air thick with the scent of old leather and tension, contemplating the next move. Leo was in the next room, working on a massive, complex puzzle, his mind seeking order in a world of growing chaos. Marco, pale and visibly distressed, entered with news that shattered Sandro's remaining composure. Corvus had used the warehouse incident to apply pressure where it hurt most: the government contracts and city officials under Sandro's influence. They were facing an immediate, aggressive audit. The official channels were rapidly closing down, signaling a coordinated, comprehensive assault. The vultures didn't just want the box. They wanted to dismantle Sandro Rossi entirely. Suddenly, a communication came through the encrypted line, not from Marco, but from an unknown, heavily scrambled source. Sandro accepted the call immediately, his hand tight around the phone receiver. The voice on the other end was distorted, synthesized, yet the underlying tone was unmistakably condescending and familiar. It was Corvus. "Don Rossi," the synthesized voice hissed, cutting through the silence. "The little sparrow has found a dangerous nest, a beautiful, strong nest." Sandro remained silent, letting the younger predator spend his energy. "I know the boy is with you. I know Antonio left a little souvenir behind. We can stop this noise. You've had your run. I offer you a clean exchange, the boy and the box for your retirement, immediately and forever. Walk away, and I will leave your immediate family untouched. Refuse, and I will ensure that the strength the boy admires in you becomes the very thing that buries him. I will not stop at warehouses." This was the critical choice, the fulcrum of the entire conflict. Sandro could hand Leo over, claiming ignorance of the box, and potentially save his empire. Or he could protect the boy, accepting the irreversible reality that he was now back in the game, fighting a war he had tried to escape. He looked through the slightly ajar door at Leo, engrossed in the puzzle, his brow furrowed in concentration. The boy sought strength to survive. The boss sought redemption for a life built on necessary cruelty. Sandro's response was sharp and final, delivered with the absolute authority that had terrified New York for decades. You threaten an innocent, you burn what is mine, and you think I will negotiate my honor with a jackal. You do not understand this life, Corvus. I do not walk away. I come for what is mine, and I protect those under my roof. The boy stays, the box stays hidden. You want me? You come and get me. He slammed the phone down, the brittle plastic protesting the force. The ultimatum had been delivered, and Sandro had chosen war. He had chosen the boy's innocence over his own stability, sealing his commitment to revealing the lethal consequences of true strength. Sandro's refusal was a match struck in dry tinder. Corvus responded immediately, increasing the pressure with calculated precision. The first target wasn't the compound itself, but the sense of security and trust within Sandro's circle. Marco, returning from a deep sweep of old informants, noticed the subtle change the moment he stepped into his apartment. A lingering scent of ozone and synthetic cleanser, far too sterile for his home. His secured office lines had been cleanly compromised and detailed. Encrypted files detailing the logistical operation were gone. The vultures had walked through his layers of digital defense without leaving a trace. It was a humiliating, terrifying violation. The internal fallout was swift. Sandro gathered his most trusted capos in the cellar meeting room, the stone walls absorbing the heavy tension. He looked at Marco, usually his rock of competence, standing stiffly against the wall, his loyalty unshaken. But his confidence shattered. The Don addressed the room, his voice low and cutting. Someone knew Marco's rhythm, someone sold us the weakness. The group erupted in strained whispers and mutual accusations. This internal division was precisely what Corvus intended. The strength Leo admired, the unbreakable facade of control, was cracking from within. Sandro knew that revealing the true crisis, the small boy upstairs and the stolen box, would only amplify the panic. He carried the burden alone, allowing the blame to circulate, knowing that if he showed weakness, the entire structure would collapse. Meanwhile, Leo remained upstairs, oblivious to the war waged beneath him. His strength lesson continued, focusing now on observation. Sandro had him watch silent footage of city traffic, instructing him to identify subtle patterns. The car that passed twice, the driver who checked his mirrors too often. It was a lesson in paranoia disguised as prudence, preparing him for the life of hypervigilance that real power demanded. One evening, Leo discovered a small metallic object tucked inside an expensive clock in the library, a tiny listening bug, still active. He brought it to Sandro, his small hand offering the electronic insect. "It shouldn't be here, sir," he stated simply, having learned enough about security to recognize an unauthorized device. Sandro felt a chilling wave of realization. The vultures hadn't just breached Marco's defenses, they had planted a listener directly inside the Don's command center. The violation was deeply personal, meaning that Corvus had heard every word of their previous planning session, every detail of the crisis, and, crucially, the fact that Leo was still there. Sandro took the bug, crushing it silently beneath his heavy boot. The danger was no longer outside. It had been inside the house, listening to the secrets of the boy who requested strength. The window for a measured response had closed. The time for calculated action was now. The revelation of the listening bug, ironically discovered by the very boy he was trying to shield, served as Sandro's catalyst. Leo's quiet competence, his capacity for observation honed by fear, was a terrifying echo of the kind of strength Sandro truly possessed. If the vultures had heard everything, they knew Sandro was scrambling to find the box, and that Leo was his greatest vulnerability. The Dawn needed to find the box immediately, and simultaneously create a massive diversion to draw Corvus's attention away from the brownstone. Sandro called Marco, who was running on fumes, and gave him the final, irreversible plan. "We stop looking for the box," Sandro commanded, the switch in strategy sharp and unexpected. "We look for who Antonio gave it to before." He came back to Red Hook. Who was his emergency contact? Not official, Marco. Personal. Who helped him when the system failed? Marco, relieved to have a clear directive, used his deepest, most shadowed contacts. The old-timers, the legitimate faces who secretly owed Sandro everything. They tracked Antonio's movements in the days leading up to his confrontation, not through digital footprints, but through physical witnesses, the smell of freshly cut lumber and old-fashioned favors. The trail led quickly to a small, nearly bankrupt pawn shop in Queens, owned by an elderly woman named Elena, Antonio's godmother. Antonio had dropped something off just hours before his death. With the first piece of the puzzle solved, Sandro moved to execute the diversion. He ordered a strategic, controlled leak of false operational details, making it appear as if the box was being moved from the brownstone to a secure vault downtown that very night. He ensured Corvus's compromised lines picked up the chatter. It was a high-risk gamble, forcing the vultures to choose between pursuing the valuable asset and attacking the Dawn's home. Sandro looked at Leo. The boy was still sitting, seemingly calm, but the tension was palpable in the house, a low hum of impending confrontation that even a child could detect. Sandro walked over to him, placing a hand on the boy's small shoulder. "Leo," he said, looking the boy directly in the eye. "The strength you seek is not about hitting hardest. It is about understanding the moment to run and the moment to be invisible. Tonight, you must be invisible. We are entering a phase where the city gets loud, and quiet is the only shield." He arranged for Leo to sleep deep within the house's basement vault, a place secured against everything but a direct strike by heavy ordnance, a place of absolute silence. Thank you for staying with us as the stakes get this high. Making videos like this requires a lot of time and effort, and we do it completely for free because we love storytelling. If you want to support this channel and help us reach our big goal of 1,000 subscribers, please take a moment right now and hit the subscribe button. Your support allows us to continue bringing you more high-quality, suspenseful narratives. The night was heavy and silent, punctuated only by the distant rhythmic clang of a ship bell in the harbor. Sandro had secured Leo in the deepest part of the basement vault, a cold, steel-lined room that smelled faintly of oil and old currency. He gave the boy a single worn paperback book and a bottle of water, a silent promise of return. Leo, having been taught the gravity of the situation, simply nodded, his small face serious, absorbing the demand for silence as the ultimate form of strength. Upstairs, the brownstone was a fortress on high alert, but deliberately understaffed. Sandro and Marco, along with 3 trusted elderly bodyguards, were the only ones present, a meager force designed to sell the illusion that the real assets were elsewhere. Sandro sat in his study, the rich velvet of the armchair feeling less comforting than usual. He waited, listening to the subtle movements of the night, the silence of the room becoming its own pressure. The attack came not as a storm, but as a precise incision. There was no explosion, no crash, only the sharp metallic sound of the heavy front door lock being bypassed with terrifying efficiency. The ambient low-frequency hum on the security speakers suddenly spiked, the sound of organized, swift movement. Corvus had ignored the decoy and chosen the personal attack. He was coming for the boy. Marco, positioned near the main staircase, whispered into his earpiece, the sound crackling with anticipation. "They are fast, boss, and too quiet, too professional." The vultures moved like shadows, their footsteps muffled by advanced gear. They didn't sweep the rooms. They headed straight for the communications hub and the primary residential areas. Sandro and his men engaged in defensive action, using the architecture of the old house, the narrow halls, the heavy confusing placement of antique furniture, to their advantage. There were sudden sharp commotions, brief intense scuffles that ended quickly. Sandro moved through the shadows, a ghost in his own home, using knowledge of the layout as his primary weapon. He avoided direct confrontation, focused instead on disrupting their flow. The air grew heavy with the smell of burnt electrical wiring from where the vultures had neutralized a control panel. As they realized the building was mostly empty, their movements grew frustrated, louder. They started tearing apart the upstairs rooms, searching for the box, for Leo. A critical moment arrived when one vulture, separated from the main group, cornered one of Sandro's old bodyguards near the library. Hearing the grunt of conflict and the desperate struggle, Sandro emerged from the darkness. He didn't use a firearm. He used the lethal precision of his weight and momentum, a practiced, brutal movement that ended the confrontation instantly and silently, a testament to the old-world strength Leo had asked for. He left the immediate scene, the oppressive silence returning heavier than before. Sandro moved towards the internal staircase leading to the basement, his heart pounding a slow, deliberate rhythm. He had stalled them, confused them, and bought crucial time. But the vultures were now focused, descending towards the core asset. He could hear their heavier boots on the basement steps, the low, determined voices of the hunt. The boss was trapped above the vault, knowing that the next few moments would determine whether Leo lived to understand the innocent strength of discipline, or if he would be exposed to the true lethal consequences of the power he had sought. Sandro reached the small landing above the basement stairs, taking cover behind a thick support column. Below him, the vultures were moving with focused intent, their headlamps slicing through the dusty air. He could hear their leader, Corvus, giving calm, clipped orders, a chilling contrast to the violent urgency of the situation. Corvus was not a street thug. He was a tactician, and he knew the boy was the key. In the relative quiet between the skirmishes, a heavy weariness settled over Sandro. This was the dark night of the soul. He was an old man fighting a war for a redemption he didn't deserve, all because a small, courageous boy had mistaken a monster for a hero. He thought of Leo, alone in the vault, clutching a book, relying entirely on Sandro's ability to keep the surrounding chaos at bay. The strength Leo asked for was the ability to protect others, a concept Sandro had long ago corrupted into the ability to destroy. He remembered Antonio, the boy's father, a man who had chosen loyalty over ambition, and whose final act was to trust Sandro with the safety of his legacy. Antonio had sought a clean life, but the city, the organization, and Sandro's influence had dragged him back down. Now Sandro was faced with the same choice. Let the boy descend into the cycle of violence or commit the ultimate act of protective strength by standing as a final, immovable barrier. Sandro felt the cold reality of his life. He controlled everything, but he owned nothing, least of all his peace. His power had brought only the crushing solitude that came with constantly knowing the most lethal secrets. His only regret wasn't the violence he'd perpetrated, but the innocence he'd witnessed destroyed along the way. If he failed now, Leo would not just be lost. He would become another tool in a relentless, brutal machine. Sandro had to ensure the boy survived, even if it meant sacrificing the last fragments of his own controlled world. A faint, muffled sound came from below, a heavy object scraping across the concrete floor. They were trying to breach the vault door. Sandro knew the heavy steel would hold for only minutes against the tools the vultures carried. He checked his sidearm, his grandfather's antique pistol, well-maintained but old, and felt the familiar cold reassurance of the metal. He had spent his life orchestrating battles from behind a mahogany desk. Now he was at the front line, fighting not for profit or territory, but for the purity of one brave, misguided request. He took a deep, steadying breath, the dusty metallic air filling his lungs. He would not teach Leo the lethal consequences of strength directly. He would show him, one final time, the unwavering strength of protection. Sandro moved from behind the column, stepping into the dim light of the staircase landing, making himself a visible target. He was ready to meet the vultures, knowing that this confrontation would either be his end or Leo's future. Sandro stepped into the light, casting a long, imposing shadow down the basement stairs. The vultures, focused on the heavy vault door, froze instantly. Corvus, distinguishable by his expensive black tactical gear, slowly turned, a look of amused surprise spreading across his face. "The old Don emerges from his tomb," Corvus drawled, his voice no longer synthesized, but sharp and confident, echoing slightly in the cold basement. "I admire the theatrics, Rossi, but this is the new world. We are surgical. We don't need your slow dances of honor." Sandro ignored the taunt, his focus absolute. "You broke my peace. You tried to poison my house. You seek a debt that is not yours to collect, Corvus." Corvus laughed, a short, barking sound. "The boy's father had my information that could destabilize entire blocks of the city. He hid it in a little wooden box. You will give me the boy, and you will tell me where Antonio stashed the asset, or I will open that vault and take them both." He motioned for his men to resume their work on the door. The loud, grating sound of specialized tools biting into steel screamed through the small space. Sandro raised his grandfather's pistol, the antique weapon looking utterly out of place in the high-tech, lethal environment. He didn't aim for Corvus, but for the heavy overhead support beam directly above the vultures, the one supporting the massive heating unit. The shot was deafening, the report echoing with a violent finality. The immediate consequence was not carnage, but controlled structural damage. The bullet struck precisely, fracturing the metal support. The old heating unit immediately shifted, emitting a terrifying groan of stressed metal. Corvus's men scrambled back, realizing the boss had just threatened to bury them all under tons of industrial equipment. "This is the strength you do not possess, Corvus." Sandro's voice cut through the confusion. "The strength of limits. I protect what is mine. You take one more step towards that vault, and I bring this entire section of the foundation down. You may get what you came for, but you will never walk out to use it." Corvus, realizing he was facing a man willing to commit total self-destruction, hesitated. His gaze shifted from the compromised ceiling to the Don's unwavering eyes. This was not a bluff. This was the genuine, frightening strength of an animal defending its last progeny. He finally understood that Sandro was not protecting an asset. He was protecting an ideal, Leo's innocence, and was ready to pay the ultimate lethal consequence to uphold it. The standoff lasted only 3 heavy heartbeats, but it felt like an eternity, thick with the smell of gunpowder and the ozone of the vault door's breached lock. Corvus, defeated by the Don's willingness to lose everything, issued a frustrated, harsh order to retreat. "Not worth the collapse. Fall back." Sandro stood his ground, maintaining his aim until the last sound of the vulture's retreat faded into the night. He had won the confrontation, saving Leo, but at a catastrophic cost. The shot had been heard throughout the quiet neighborhood. The fight was far from over, but the boy was safe, at least for now. The silence that followed the retreat of the vultures was broken only by the squeak of the damaged heating unit settling above and the distant sirens responding to the commotion. Sandro lowered the pistol, his hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the immense adrenaline crash. He secured the vault door and waited for Marco to confirm the all-clear, the metallic scent of gunpowder heavy in the air. Once the immediate threat passed, Sandro opened the vault. Leo was sitting exactly where he had been left, the paperback still resting on his knees. He looked up, his eyes filled with immense curiosity and relief, but no panic. He had heard the single gunshot, the chaotic movements and the sound of the retreat, but he had trusted the sanctuary Sandro provided. Sandro helped Leo out of the cold vault. "The quiet is back," the Don said simply, avoiding any mention of the battle. Leo just nodded, absorbing the implicit lesson. Sometimes the greatest strength is not the ability to fight, but the ability to remain calm and unseen while chaos reigns. The next morning, Marco returned from Queens, carrying the item Antonio had pawned, the small, intricately carved wooden box. It wasn't a container for cash or diamonds. Inside, nested in red velvet, were micro SD cards containing a complete, irrefutable digital record of every illegal transaction, every corrupt official, and every coordinated move made by Corvus's organization over the last 5 years. It was leverage, pure and simple, the kind of proof that could bring down an entire syndicate through legal channels, avoiding the need for further bloodshed. Antonio, the man of honor, had ensured his legacy was not vengeance, but justice. Sandro immediately recognized the payoff. This was the true strength, information, not intimidation. He called his lawyers, instructing them to anonymize the evidence and release it simultaneously to federal authorities and multiple major news outlets. He didn't want a quiet arrest. He wanted an undeniable public collapse of the vultures, ensuring Corvus's entire power structure was decimated and his threat eliminated legally and permanently. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Within 48 hours, the first arrests were made. Corvus, who believed he operated above the law, found himself caught in the net of irrefutable digital evidence, the strength of the old Don's measured response, proving far more devastating than any street war. Sandro, watching the news reports in his library, finally felt the heavy weight of decades lift slightly. He had protected Leo's future by choosing the least violent path available to him, revealing the lethal consequences of true strength not through his own actions, but by ensuring Corvus faced the consequences of his own. Weeks later, the dust settled. Corvus's organization was systematically dismantled, not by a turf war, but by the relentless quiet force of law enforcement, using Antonio's irrefutable evidence. The Don's compound was quiet once more, smelling of polish and old wood, the scent of conflict finally fading. Sandro sat in the library, looking at the small wooden box. He still bore the cost of the confrontation, the severe damage to his brownstone, the scrutiny from the authorities, and the internal chaos caused by Corvus's initial sabotage. He was not financially ruined, but his control had been irreparably fractured. He was finally, truly retired, forced into an early definitive exit by the very innocence he chose to protect. The silence was absolute, a powerful symbol of the purpose he had regained. Leo's mother, Mrs. Silva, secured in a new, safe life, far from Red Hook, had arranged for Leo to attend a highly regarded school outside of the city, focusing on STEM subjects. She understood the debt they owed Sandro, a debt he refused to acknowledge. His only demand was Leo's future. On Leo's last day at the brownstone, he came to Sandro in the library. He was wearing new clothes, standing taller, his gaze still serious, but now infused with a sense of forward momentum instead of fear. The boy hadn't witnessed the violence of the climax, only the calculated aftermath. "Sir," Leo started, his hands clasped behind his back. "Thank you for teaching me strength." Sandro met the boy's eyes. He had failed to teach Leo the strength of virtue or forgiveness. He had taught him observation, discipline, and the terrifying power of quiet knowledge. But by standing between Leo and the vultures, Sandro had perhaps inadvertently taught him the most important lesson of all, the strength of protection. "You are already strong, Leo," Sandro said, his voice soft, an echo of the vulnerability he had shown when the boy first asked his question. "Now go, and use that strength to build things that cannot be burned." Leo nodded, understanding the gravity of the parting. He didn't ask about the gunfire or the intruders. He only saw the result, security, and a future. He turned to leave, but paused by the heavy oak door. He looked back at Sandro, the aging Don who had traded his empire for the boy's innocence and offered a small, knowing smile, the first true sign of peace Sandro had witnessed in months. Sandro watched the car drive away, carrying the boy toward a life free of lethal consequences, built on the foundations of a powerful man's last, desperate act of grace. The Don, now truly alone, finally tasted the bittersweet strength of redemption. He had chosen to be the shield, ensuring that the boy who sought power found freedom instead. The boss's eyes were dry now, holding only the cold certainty of his sacrifice and the quiet hope of Leo's future.